Hello, everybody. This is the final lecture in Unit 3, Post-Impressionism with three-dimensional art forms. We're looking at sculpture and architecture, and we'll also be looking at the technology of photography. So the main names to look out for in this section are the two sculptors Rodin and Camille Claudel. We'll also be looking at the architecture of Louis Sullivan in America, which sort of brings us to the birth of the skyscraper. So we're setting the stage really for the modern world that you grew up in. So Rodin is our starting point, and he often is categorized as a sculptor who does a mixture of realism, post-impressionism. There's obviously a hint of romanticism in what's happening here, at least in terms of there being a very curvaceous form of the female body in particular. But it is kind of hard to categorize Rodin because, of course, his work that you're seeing here is really from the late 1880s, headed into the 1890s. So wrong time period, truly, to be either a neoclassicist or a romanticist, even though there is obvious attention to the anatomy that we saw in the neoclassical, and we see this incredible movement and curvature that we saw in romanticism. He kind of defines, or defies rather, the easy categorization. He is an artist who will make distortions to the figure to suit his own expressive ends, which really puts him more firmly in the category of a post-impressionist. So really the key thing to remember here is that he is a figure in sculpture who's doing things somewhat similar to what the Impressionists and, more importantly, what the post-impressionists were doing, giving us a little more freedom to use abstraction and a little more freedom to interpret things in an imaginative way. He ultimately is also interesting for us in terms of his personal relationships. He was involved with one of his students and eventual studio assistants, Camille Claudel. We know that he at one time in fact impregnated her. She had an abortion, and that very much ended their relationship, but she remained dependent upon him financially because her family were not particularly fond of her career in the arts. So Camille Claudel, in fact, ended up having to kind of depend on Rodin after their relationship ended because the family had very much tightened their purse strings. After her father's death, she really had a hard time financially. Eventually, she started to show some signs of emotional stress, and her brother and her mother conspired to have her committed to an insane asylum. And in fact, they refused the asylum's recommendation that she was in fact healthy and well and should be released. They refused to agree to it. She spent the remaining 30 years of her life in that asylum. So a kind of tragic love story between Rodin and Camille Claudel. Rodin, of course, is known for images that you might be familiar with. This is the figure, a thinker, modeled for the entrance here, known as the Gates of Hell, based on Dante's Divine Comedy. These were intended, of course, to serve as the doors to the entrance of the Museum of the Decorative Arts. So we have a very important public commission. It kind of draws all the way back in our minds to the work of Ghiberti in the competition for the doors for the baptistry back in Florence. The pieces you want to know for sure for the test, though, by Rodin include this one, The Burghers of Calais. This is an awesome story. The Burghers of Calais is a true story. This event did actually take place during the 100 Years' War. So this is a conflict in the Middle Ages between England and France. And Calais is a French city on the English Channel. And the British had besieged the city. They were unable to defend themselves. The citizens of Calais realized that they were going to be overrun, and so an agreement was reached that if the burghers, the city elders, would humble themselves and appear bareheaded, barefooted, and then also carrying the keys to the city. If they presented themselves, then the people of the city would be spared. So here you see the burghers kind of reacting in a variety of different emotional states to this inevitable conflict that they are trying to resolve, that they are facing what they think is imminent death. They expect to be executed. In fact, the Queen of England at the time interceded with her husband, and she felt that murdering these volunteers would bring bad luck upon them. She was pregnant at the time, and so she convinced her husband that it might cause harm to their child, so they were spared. But at the time that the sculpture is depicting for us, the moment that we're seeing, the men don't know that they're going to survive. They believe that they are willingly sacrificing themselves for the good of the people. So if you look at different angles of the sculpture, if you look at different faces of each individual figure, there are 6 in total, you can see different emotional states, from resignation, defiance, sorrow, fear, and the faces do seem to move. Here's a really good shot that's a little bit from a different angle than what we just saw. The piece has been actually cast multiple times. So that means that the original piece was sculpted in wax. A mold is made of that piece. The mold then can be filled with molten metal. So there are reproductions. Several exist around the world. The one you just saw was at the Houses of Parliament in London. This example is in the collection, the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. The Hirshhorn Museum in Washington, D.C. owns one, and it was originally, of course, created for the town of Calais. But when you turn to the side, if you see any of the castings, this happens to be really bad shots from the Hirshhorn Museum, but if you see it from alternates, you can see that the entire sculpture really does feel like it's moving, kind of all leaning inexorably toward one fate. That hand kind of pointing to God gives us a sense of that ultimate belief that you're doing the right thing from a moral standpoint, even though you may lose your life in doing so. This other piece by Rodin to know for the test is called Walking Man. It's a pretty incredible piece in that it is so extremely abstract. This is not meant to be someone beheaded or with their arms removed from some form of torture. This is in fact an intentional abstraction, and we haven't really seen that in sculpture up to this point. So you can see that Rodin has pushed past mere direct observation and moved into this category of creating a fusion between his vision, his emotion, his intent, and a representation that would be recognizable to people as something from the real world. So he really is truly a post-impressionist sculptor. You can even kind of see the way he's pushing and molding the form here, because you can sort of detect some of the work of his hands and tools in the wax. You can see the little impressions in the torso in particular. This piece was actually made or amalgamated from 2 separate pieces that Rodin was working on in his studio. So he had started legs of one figure, changed the position, abandoned those, was working on a torso for a completely separate piece, abandoned that, and then came up with the idea of combining these 2 things together into a new form. So it's really kind of a remarkable step forward in terms of giving us some abstraction. This is the work of his lover, Camille Claudel. She was quite talented in her own right. There are plenty of people who argue whether she had more of an influence on him or vice versa. The piece of hers, though, to recognize for the test is perhaps her most iconic. This is known as Ripe Age. It is sometimes translated the title as Age of Maturity, and what you're seeing ultimately is a older male figure, and I suppose he could represent a father or an older male relative of the kneeling female figure on the right, but he's being embraced by kind of an angelic spirit that functions more or less as an angel of death. He's being carried on to the next phase of his life. The much younger female figure that you see is kind of pleading, hoping for him to stay, wishing for him to remain in the earthly living realm. But the piece also, of course, given the story of the relationship between Rodin and Claudel, also somewhat works in terms of their personal relationship. You could see this as an older man mentor abandoning a younger lover really quite easily. It's an incredibly poignant piece, really quite beautiful to see in person. Definitely want to think a little bit about three-dimensional arts, about the technology of architecture in particular. We've already looked at the Crystal Palace and the Great Exhibition of Works of Industry of All Nations of 1851 in London. Now, of course, this was the idea, or inspiration for the idea really came from Prince Albert, consort of Queen Victoria. He wanted to create essentially a World's Fair that would showcase the art and industry of particularly states within the British Empire, nations within the United Kingdoms. But when you take a look at what really happened here, you see that it was expanded to include nations all around the world, including, of course, the United States. So there was no site in London big enough to hold the event. So they had a building custom built on a site to be able to house the exhibition, which required a massive amount of space. The main section of the building is almost 2,000 feet in length. It's 100 feet plus at the apex of the transept, the crossing space. And you can see in the photograph, or the colorized print at the bottom, that in fact they built the building right around existing trees on site. The building went up in a matter of months. This is larger than many cathedrals that would have taken decades to build, and that's all because of the use of new sorts of technology thanks to the Industrial Revolution. The pieces, the individual sections or elements of the building were cast iron, and they were made essentially in a factory situation, made ahead of time and shipped to the site and then assembled on site. So we call that prefabricated, pre-made. The pieces were already created and then shipped to the place where they were being built, as opposed to building with stone, having stone arrive at the location and then being cut and carved, as we say, dressed to be able to be worked with. So it's almost like putting together an enormous Lego set, if you will. So the idea here is that the architect, Joseph Paxton, was really known for creating greenhouses, for creating objects, or buildings rather, made with cast iron and with glass, and that's very much the technology here. So cast iron's great. It has the ability to be replicated, so you can create multiple pieces. You could build almost infinitely with this material, but it has some limitations. It is fairly heavy, and for its weight, it's fairly brittle. So we do see people turning away from cast iron. Here's a pretty famous iron building, the Gustav Eiffel Tower, which some people, when it was built, which it was built originally for World's Fair in Paris, when it was originally constructed, there were people who thought that it was unfinished, that they were going to face the building with some marble or make it look pretty. In fact, there's a story about a newspaper reporter who decided that the only place that he could eat lunch in Paris anymore was the cafe that used to be at the top of the Eiffel Tower, because it was the only place in the city where he didn't have to look at the damn thing because he thought it was so ugly, which I thought's kind of a funny story. This technology, though, does have some limitations. As I said, it can be rather brittle, it can crack, it's pretty heavy. So we see the advent of steel frame technology. So this brings us to the architect Louis Sullivan. Sullivan is known for the birth of the skyscraper in the United States. And it's kind of funny to say that. Look at this picture, because you can see there's a much taller building just to the left in this shot. But you can see, if you imagine that building not being, you can see that this is really rather a tall structure, certainly taller than most office buildings of its time. And that's made possible because steel frame is going to allow you to have a lighter material that's much stronger than iron. You can build an interior skeleton of the building and then clad it with whatever material you like, brick or glass, what have you. But it's also kind of intriguing to know that as you're looking at this building, you can see it's broken into a three-part facade or face. The base of the building clearly indicates the main entrance, and then the decorative quality around the windows changes significantly in the body of the building. It very much emphasizes vertical lines. There's brickwork alternating with the windows that have little iron insets underneath them, so it creates kind of dark lines next to thin red lines. As you know from the clothing industry, when you look at vertical lines, your eye tends to be drawn up the form, so it makes things look taller and thinner rather than wide. You can also see at the top of the building that there's an enormous amount of decoration there, so it kind of mimics the structure of the Ionic and Corinthian orders going all the way back to ancient Greece. There's sort of a base design. The shaft is a slightly different appearance, and the capital has a different appearance there as well. So Louis Sullivan is also important for us because he gave Frank Lloyd Wright his start in architecture, and that'll change architecture in the 20th century. But I also want us to be familiar with this particular design philosophy of Louis Sullivan. Form follows function. Form, as we know, is anything that contributes to the appearance of a piece of art, and function, of course, means how the object is used. So in this case, form, the appearance, follows, comes after function. So the first consideration is how is the thing going to be used, and then we design to suit that need. You'll see that here in the example that I've chosen for the test. This one is known as the Guarantee Building. It's sometimes referred to as the Prudential Building. Initially, the commission came from a Mr. Taylor, a millionaire in Buffalo, New York. He wanted to have a building named after himself, kind of cement his legacy in Buffalo. Unfortunately, he died before the project was completed, so it became named after the construction firm that actually completed the project, and then it became the main office building in Buffalo for the Prudential Insurance Company. So you could either call it the Guarantee Building or the Prudential Building. The building itself is very similar to what we just looked at, but it's even a little bit taller, and of course that's thanks to our steel frame technology. You can see in these insets at the left bottom how much detail there is, drawing your eye to the very beautiful details around the entrances. You can see there is a lot of decorative work also in the vertical section around the windows, but you can clearly see a separation between the decorative quality at the base level, the ground level, directing your attention to the entrance, then drawing your eye up those long vertical lines between the windows during looking at the shaft, so to speak, if we keep with our analogy of the columns. And then there's an enormous amount of decorative quality at the top around those circular windows. This gives you a better sense of what that looks like there at the top. It's a really beautiful piece of architecture. So of course, as the buildings get taller and taller, we're going to evolve into a slightly different appearance. The style here has some elements that kind of remind me a little bit of some of the carving and decorative quality that we saw in cathedrals in the Gothic style, or the Romanesque style, certainly. You're going to see that as buildings get taller, keeping those kinds of styles on an enormously tall building starts to look a little silly. So we'll see the skyscraper evolve a bit in the next one. We definitely want to take a little quick look here at photography and how that develops toward the end of the century. This is the work of Jacob Riis. He was a photojournalist first and foremost. He was using the camera as a way of capturing current events and reporting them back to the public. So he didn't set out to make art. That wasn't his intent. Now, he was a massively gifted photographer who definitely had the eye of an artist. So nowadays, we look at these works and really consider them to be both photojournalism, but also so incredibly well composed and thoughtfully created that they would still qualify for us today, of course, as art. But that's not what he was trying to do. What Jacob Riis was doing was trying to expose some of the sins of our culture. So you see on the left what appear to be men just kind of hanging out in an alleyway between two buildings. Because they have jackets and they appear to be wearing ties and hats, they may seem a little bit more respectable to you, but in fact what you're looking at are gangsters. These are sort of the bodyguards who are guarding the entrance to essentially a mob headquarters. So Jacob Riis was really in quite a lot of danger taking this photograph, but it was because of his reporting that there was a crackdown on this burgeoning world of organized crime. So he's really quite an influential figure. He also addressed issues like homelessness, and you see that on the far right-hand side. It's easy to think of the issue of homelessness being something from the 20th or 21st centuries, but that issue has been around as long as there has been inequality in terms of income. And so what you're seeing on the right is a women's shelter, essentially. This is where women could pay a few cents to be able to find a place to sleep at night. So Jacob Riis is definitely calling our attention to some social issues that may be familiar to us today as well. Another issue that comes up in the discussion of the evolution of photography is the work of Edward Muybridge. Now, Muybridge was friends with Thomas Eakins, and we saw Eakins using photography to help him create the illusion of people moving in athletic ways in three-dimensional space. So you can see that in Muybridge's photographs at the bottom right. He's really well known for sequences or series of photographs that show human figures or animals in motion, so that we get a sense of how the body changes as different muscles are engaged to do different movements. So there are interesting sets of photographs by Muybridge of people doing all sorts of activities. The one here is turning and running, but there are also ones that are a little less dramatic. There are ones of people swinging baseball bats or swinging tennis rackets, but it definitely is an attempt to capture something that would happen in a fleeting moment. So when you see them in sequence like that, it's really easy to imagine the connection between this and simple animation. If you see three slightly different images in rapid succession, about 30 frames per second, it will appear as if the image is actually moving, and that's the basis of the idea of the motion picture camera. So Muybridge actually invented what was known as the zoopraxiscope, and that's what you see here. On the left is a zoopraxiscope, on the right is a disc that is photographs reproduced of the horse running that you just saw on the previous slide. And so this would, if you viewed it through the zoopraxiscope, if it was spinning, create the illusion, essentially the way a flip book does, creates the illusion of motion. So really we're just a little bit ahead of the invention of the motion picture camera. And that's the end of Unit 3.